Of the key drivers for better financial reporting by the public sector. And in this next section, we'll hear from three speakers about their different perspectives on how things are developing in the public sector and the direction of travel for public sector reporting. This is an area that I am particularly interested in myself. As Gillian said, I now work at Monitor, which is an organisation which really, it's a sector regulator for NHS provider services, and its objective is to ensure that there are better services for patients, and part of that is considering the sustainability of NHS Foundation trusts, and good financial information is absolutely key to that. At my time at the Audit Commission, I was fortunate enough to lead on some significant financial reporting areas, including adoption of IFRS by the NHS and wider public sector, as well as the Treasury's alignment project, which was all about improving the transparency of public sector reporting. So I'm particularly interested to hear this session from our speakers today. We're going to hear from each speaker in turn, and then there'll be 10 minutes or so for questions at the end of the session. So I'll just introduce you to our speakers in turn. Starting us off, we have Ron Hodges, who's a fellow member of the ACCA Public Sector Global Forum. Ron has a long academic career and is currently at the Birmingham Business School and an active member of FRAB. Ron is also the author of a very well-received retrospective study on PFI, which is, of course, a key area affected by changes in financial reporting requirements. We also have today Alexandre Makaronidis, who is currently at Eurostat, leading the European Commission's work on the adoption of EPSAS, which is the European version of IPSAS. This is particularly important in Europe, where member states really need to have a good understanding of each other's financial positions and underlying levels of debt when supporting each other. And finally, we have Patrice Chumès, who's a partner at PwC Global. Patrice has extensive experience in IPSAS and is currently working with Eurostat. Patrice is the co-author of two excellent pieces of work, a PwC Global survey on accounting and reporting by central governments, which was released last year, and an excellent handy guide to IPSAS entitled IPSAS in a Nutshell. So full biographies are available in your packs, but in the interest of keeping things moving, I think we'll now hand over to Ron as our first speaker.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Carla, and good morning, everyone. The topic, the title of my talk, you'll see, is Worrying About OOBs. Nothing to do with Doctor Who, but rather obligations off balance sheet. And after Zinga's nicely internationally focused talk, I am unashamedly parochial in this presentation. It's entirely UK based, but I hope that those of you from outside the UK will nevertheless get something from it. Particularly if your government is to try and make things happen, is throwing out guarantees like our government is. So it's a UK topic, but perhaps has implications somewhat wider than that. I can get this to work. Yeah, okay. The usual caveats or disclaimers. This is a personal perspective on OOBs, and so shouldn't be taken to represent the views of the Birmingham Business School necessarily, or the University of Birmingham, or the Financial Reporting Advisory Board, or indeed the ACCA. It develops from my inaugural professorial lecture at the University of Birmingham that I did last month, when I looked at the troubled history of PFI accounting, and then that set me thinking about, what might replace the troubled history of PFI accounting with the troubled history of other sorts of accounting. And so the talk today, it partly draws on that talk, And I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the background and the results of accounting for PFI. But then I'll think about new forms of OOBs, in particular guarantees, and try and draw some conclusions. Why worry about OOBs? In my view, partly because the existence of significant obligations off balance sheet can lead to an absence or a limitation of accountability of public sector activities. And secondly, if it becomes a routine way of carrying out public service activities, I think it can also lead to poor contracting. So I think there are various reasons for worrying about OOBs. Let me say a few things about PFI and public-private partnerships as OOBs first of all. I'll go quickly through this. This may be familiar to many of you, but public-private partnerships is a very broad description of arrangements where the public sector and the private sector in some way work together. So a very broad view is taken. For example, a Treasury document back in 2000 talks about public-private partnerships, including all sorts of things, including things like even asset sales they describe as public-private partnerships. And Kernahan wrote a paper back in 1993 describing the very broad nature, conceptual nature of partnerships. And in the UK, we have a particular type of public-private partnership called the Private Finance Initiative, which essentially involves contractual schemes where the private sector designs, builds and operates significant assets in which public services are constructed around those assets, and the public sector, the taxpayer, pays for this with service payments, with annual payments, perhaps over significant periods of time. And we've got lots of examples of this. I mean, more generally in terms of public-private partnerships, nuclear energy, I think, is an interesting one. You know, where we make arrangements to build and have developed and run stations to develop nuclear power. I think this particular one is actually Sizewell rather than the current one that's in the news at Hinkley Point. So that's a PPP. The picture here of a classic PFI is actually the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, the University of Birmingham Hospital, a classic PFI which has been built and designed and run and is now financed under service contracts which involve payments up to 2046. And in my professorial address, I talked about accounting for PFI, about the birth, the growth, the death and the resurrection of PFI and accounting for PFI. I won't go into the same sort of detail today, but we'll just mention one or two aspects of it. First of all, the early years of accounting for PFI, I think, give us some interesting perspectives on what may happen for other types of schemes now. There is a literature on voluntary disclosure of information, a literature that argues that regulation isn't always needed to enforce disclosure of financial information. Back in the 1990s, I was working with Howard Mellett, and we wrote a paper published in 1999 about the early years of disclosing PFI transactions, and we actually